The grid is very important to our lives. In Texas, when the grid went down and people couldn't get heat in their house, so that some of them froze. I mean, literally died of hypothermia. Others decided they would bring an outdoor heater inside, and they died of carbon monoxide. People die when you can't get the grid operating.
Welcome to the Political Economy Project, with the goal of creating universal prosperity for today and future generations. My name is Evan Papp, and I'm the executive producer for Empathy Media Lab that publishes content on labor, political economy, art, and culture, and we're a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with author and energy analyst Meredith Angwin. We'll be discussing her book, Shorting the Grid, The Hidden Fragility of Our Electric Grid, which is an expose of the insider-ruled practices of the deregulated areas of the United States electric grid. Meredith, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I was able to read this book and I want to promote it far and wide. I learned so much, and so many people in the United States have no understanding of where their electricity comes from. But before we get into the book, could you begin by introducing yourself?
Yes, I'm Meredith Angwin, and I wrote Shorting the Grid. My career, I was a chemist. I got a master's degree in physical chemistry, and most of my career was improving various things for the utility industry. The utility industry has a research arm called the Electric Power Research Institute, which sponsors research which will help utilities do a better job. For example, corrosion control research, pollution control research, and so forth. And I was one of the first women to be a project manager at the Electric Power Research Institute. And then I actually worked in many areas. I worked at nitrogen oxide control for gas-fired plants, in hydrogen sulfide control for H2S plants, and corrosion control for nuclear plants. I mean, I was just all over the place. And so I learned a lot about the technologies of making power, all kinds of technologies, not just one. At any rate, I was living in California, which is where the Electric Power Research Institute is located. And when I retired, we moved to Vermont because our kids were both on the East Coast. As a matter of fact, one of them was in Vermont at the time, but he subsequently moved to New Jersey. And I wanted to be close to my grandkids. I didn't like this idea that I'll fly in from California once a year at the holidays and say, "Oh, you grow up." I wanted to be involved in their lives at some level, So we moved here, and then I wanted to continue to be involved in utilities and the grid. And well, what happened was I began being for nuclear power, and then I began writing a blog about our local nuclear plant, Vermont Yankee, which has unfortunately been shut down since then. And I think it was one of the biggest union plants in the state, union facilities in the state. And it completely shocked me that the Democratic governor and legislature were so eager to shut it down. But leaving that aside for a moment, I began advocating for it. And one of the things is I've always liked to write. And so I began a blog. About Vermont Yankee. And as I was writing this blog, every now and again, Vermont Yankee's interaction with the grid would come up. So I would research it up and ask people and write a blog post. And so it turned out there was a man in the consumer liaison group of our grid operator. And he said, "Why don't you join the consumer liaison group with the grid operator?" And I said, "Well, now that you told me it exists, I think it's a good idea." I did not know the consumer liaison group existed. They don't advertise it a lot, okay? If you're on their mailing list, you get the mailings, but if you're not on their mailing list, good luck. So at any rate, eventually I became a part of the steering committee, which they call the coordinating committee, and I really began learning a lot about the grid. Now, unlike other things I'd learned about, which I found I could explain pretty simply, let me tell you about nitrogen oxides and why they're bad. Let me tell you about how you control nitrogen oxides and then why it's imperfect. But the grid, I mean, people really, I could not explain it to people. I could not explain what was going on. And I thought, people don't know this stuff. They really don't know this stuff. They don't know how decisions are made about, they might say, oh, I want this kind of power plant or I want that kind of power plant, but they don't know decisions that are being made that that end up making the choices of what kind of power plants are on the grid. So I decided that I needed to write a book because it was like way more than one blog post or a bunch of blog posts. And at any rate, that's what I did. And I've also felt as I was learning about it, I realized that my ignorance of it wasn't just that I was lazy, it's that there are a lot of areas in managing the grid that are closed to the public. They're just closed to the public. And they don't, in my opinion, they don't need to be. I mean, like, for example, I can see why a power plant would like details of its overhead being released to the public. But what the power plant managers vote for in terms of how the grid is managed, why is that a private matter? And people should know who's planning these things. Anyway, so I consider my book to some extent an expose of grid management. So that's why I wrote it.
And so many people around the United States, when they think about energy, they really put it through a lens of climate change, and they see good energy and bad energy based on clean energy and dirty energy. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. And before going into that, within the goals of your book is you want to write this book on reliable electricity, meaning like anytime you turn on the light switch, you want to make sure that electricity comes on. You want to make sure it's
Right.
relatively inexpensive, and you want to make sure the electricity is made with low levels of pollution. And I love the analogy of the grid as the largest machine on earth, in the sense that there's generation and there's load, and that load and generation need to work together like a car, essentially. And I really love that idea that the amount of consumption happening has to match with the amount of generation happening. And it's almost this angelic system that has been stitched together, and it's so complicated on how it works, but it has worked up to this point. But we're starting to see the fragility of the grid, as you expose in your book as well.
Well, yes, I think the thing is that we don't see the matches explicitly because no one explains it to it. For example, about Texas, they say, well, the frequency on the grid was going down, and so they had to begin cutting people off of the grid. Well, that's because the amount of electricity made and the amount consumed have to match. And in Texas, they didn't have enough electricity available in February 21. And so the power plants could not keep up the frequency, which meant that there are automatic things on the power plants which will shut them off. And so before they began shutting off automatically, which is, of course, harder to deal with, the grid operator began, quote, shedding load, which means that they began shutting people off so that the frequency would go up to a level that the power plants could sustain. Now, the problem with the shutting people off, there's a lot of problems with it. The first is all of a sudden, you're instead of manipulating power plants and how they're operating, you're manipulating who gets electricity. You're shutting off to here, and then you're going to shut off to somewhere else later. The idea there is you're putting in load shedding, also known as rolling blackouts, where you black out one part of the grid so that the frequency goes up and the power plants and the amount of demand are now matched. And then after that's been shut off for an hour, you turn the area back on and then you turn another area off. Well, that is not a trivial undertaking. And in Texas, they weren't able to do it. They weren't able to roll the load from one area to another. So some areas were out of power for 2 days. And it was a cold snap, which is actually why it was happening. And the grid is very important to our lives. I mean, I mean our lives. I mean, in Texas, when the grid went down and people couldn't get heat in their house, so that some of them froze. I mean, literally died of hypothermia. Others decided they would bring an outdoor heater inside, and they died of carbon monoxide. People die when you can't get the grid operating. And if you say, well, over here, I have a gas-fired furnace, so there's no problem. Well, you know something? That furnace is controlled electrically. The electricity, that furnace may burn gas or it may burn oil, but it's controlled with electricity. And so when you don't have electricity, you don't have that either. I mean, I understand the desire to electrify everything and so forth. But I mean, really, when you get right down to it, I suggest that everybody have like a wood burning stove at home and some wood outside.
Yeah, it's almost like going backwards,
Oh
evolution in
yeah.
a way. Not
It's
not that I do love sitting by the open fire, and I was in Vermont for the first time in January, and my friend had a wood stove, and his whole garage was filled with $1,000 worth of wood, and it really was a wonderful way of heating the house. But there's plentiful wood, and he still had to pay $1,000 for the wood for the winter as well, which I'm sure you're familiar with
yes.
living
Oh
in
yes.
Vermont.
Yes. I mean, there's a lot of wood here, but when you get right down to it, wood is of course natural, but you have to cut it, you have to split it, and you have to set it around for an hour, I'm sorry, for a year to dry out before it can be burned without sizzling and without being green wood that doesn't burn well. So what I'm trying to say is there's a processing. Just the logs that they deliver and dump in your driveway for your wood stove have been processed, and the price of that is added to the price of the wood.
So you also do this great framing that there are two grids. There's the power grid and the policy grid. And I want to talk a little bit more about the power grid. And from my understanding, I came from USAID working in a initiative called Power Africa, which was looking to increase generation in sub-Saharan Africa and connections. Unfortunately, it was mostly based on a model that was also doing what we've done in the United States, which is changing the generation, transmission, and distribution, the three parts, and breaking them up from what once was vertically integrated, vertically operated utilities. And within each one of those parts, it's starting to fragment a lot of these grids using wind, solar, and natural gas. And natural gas can be very expensive trying to get into Africa as well. From my background, too, I also have nostalgia, even though I wasn't living back then, about this idea that the grid was, this great thing in the 1960s, 1970s. But in your book, too, you say there were problems with these very large vertically operated utilities, even though maybe that is the best way to go forward to try to reorganize our power structure. But could you talk a little bit the actual power grid in that model?
Well, in that model, the wonderful thing about this model is accountability. In other words, if your power goes out, you know exactly who to point to, who should have fixed it. And the powers that be, the legislatively appointed overseers of the grid, do not want the people who appointed them to look back. So if your grid is fragile and you're having a lot of power outages, they will fine the utility. So the utility finds that it will have a better bottom line if it's very reliable. Plus, the utility can pass through the costs of making it reliable. So it's win-win for the utility to be reliable. If it's reliable, it can pass through the costs of becoming reliable and won't get fined for not being reliable. Now, people would say, yeah, we used to have a gold-plated grid. And I mean, to some extent that was true. It was maybe too reliable, if there is such a thing. No, there is no such thing.
No such thing.
But the thing is that the idea was that it was gold plated, and the people who oversaw it were actually on speed dial with the utility bosses, and so they were just making money hand over fist, and the poor ratepayer was paying for it. But actually nowadays, as it is in my book, the areas that have supposedly deregulated have become more expensive than the vertically integrated areas. And that is, Charlie Munger, who's with Warren Buffett, he has a statement about show me the incentives and I'll show you the results. And that's the fact. I mean, in the old days, it was incentivized to be very reliable, even if you had to go, quote, gold plate the grid. Nowadays, there's nowhere where the buck stops. If it If you have a problem with the grid and you call, there's no one to call up. Like, for example, I said, or somebody said, well, North American Reliability Council, NERC, assures reliability. And I said, really? What about the what if there are not enough power plants to make the power? Oh, NERC isn't responsible for resource adequacy, the number of power plants. That's the state's responsibility. Really? It's the state's responsibility. But meanwhile, the state may say we need another power plant, but that power plant is going to have to bid into the auctions. It's not guaranteed that it'll make a living. As
Yeah.
a matter of fact, there's a section of my book that says selling quick kilowatt hours is not a good way to make a living for a power plant. The power plant cannot make it on kilowatt hours.
Yeah.
And so all the grid people, all the merchant power plants on the grid, they love it when the grid is in trouble, because then the the grid operator has to call on expensive diesel power plants. And the way the grid is set up, those diesel and expensive plants of various kinds set the clearing price. And that means everybody gets the clearing price. So all of a sudden, a nuclear plant the cost of their fuel hasn't changed a cent. And all of a sudden, it's getting the $4 a megawatt hour cost that the grid is going up to, instead of the 5 cents that costs it to make power. And and anyway, so yeah, there's nowhere to point to, and it becomes unreliable and expensive at the same time. Where in the vertically integrated area, you could at least say it became reliable and expensive.
Yeah. Yeah. So within the United States, we have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, and it regulates the transmission and wholesale of electricity and natural gas through the interstate commerce, and regulates the transportation of oil by pipeline interstate commerce. At least that's the official definition.
That's right.
And you also focus on a Order 2000. It was a move to standardize the market design across US to create these regional transmission RTOs, essentially,
Yes,
and the
yes,
regional
yes.
transmission organizations. And these RTOs then are trying to help manage the generation and supply. And there's you have this great analogy of the jump ball, is when it essentially, these RTOs say we need this much energy, and then these auctions happen and they bid out, and that's how it all kind of works on meeting the demand and the generation, or the load and the generation as well. Could you talk a little bit about how this order came about, why it was done, and what was the incentive and motivation?
Well, what the motivation, I think, was to make a better even playing field by having these RTOs that ran by auctions instead of making individual decisions. The trouble is they just sort of threw out the baby with the bathwater. There's no planning, and there's not any reasonable amount of planning. For example, in the old days, a utility commission would think, well, I don't know about this. We've got too many eggs in one basket. I don't want them to build another gas-fired power plant, coal-fired power plant, whatever. Let's have a grid with a variety of power plants on it, and so forth. But in the RTOs, the idea is that we're not, nobody gets to make that decision anymore. Um, the idea is that the cheapest power plants will be the ones on the grid, which of course raises the question: is what is cheap? What does it mean? What does it mean? I mean, you can say, "Oh, I know what it means. It means they cost less." Well, yeah, but the thing is that, for example, let's look at a wind turbine. For example, everybody, you look at the wind turbine, and the wind turbine is, they claim it's the least expensive thing on the grid. Really? Well, what it is it bids in to the auctions very inexpensively. It can bid in, and I will pay you 2 cents per kilowatt hour to take my power. You don't have to pay me. I'll pay you. Well, there's no plant that can compete with that. Well, why is it able to do that? It's able to do that because it gets a lot of subsidies. It gets what's called a production tax credit, 2 cents per kilowatt hour, and it can also sell a certificate for every kilowatt hour it makes. It can sell a certificate called a renewable energy credit. And so it gets all this money before it ever gets a penny for the actual kilowatt hour. You see?
Yeah.
The production tax credit, by the way, I've always thought that it is the most anti-regular people thing I can think of because, you know, you can't a tax credit doesn't do me a lot of good because I don't have a lot of income and I don't pay a lot of taxes. But a tax credit is very valuable to a successful company that has a lot of income and pays a lot of taxes. It's better than actually more income because it would have to pay more taxes on the more income.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's just really astonishing to me how it works now. But the problem is that the value of the power to the grid for a wind turbine is not that great because the wind turbine goes on and off when it wants to, not when there's a lot of requirement on the grid. And yet the wind turbine, because of the tax credits and the RECs, the renewable energy credits that it can sell, is probably the most reliable money generator for the owners of the grid. And I named my book Shorting the Grid. Partly it was a spin on shorting, but it's also partly about the big short in which the complicated systems for mortgages ended up being detached from whether or not the mortgage is likely to be repaid, which is, of course, what a banker needs to know. And since the uh, whether the mortgage was profitable to the banker no longer had much to do with whether it be repaid, the whole system became very, very weird, as described in The Big Short.
Yeah.
And it ended up hurting a lot of people. And I'm afraid that the same thing is happening on the grid because the value of the power to the grid does not make the plant profitable. And the plant and a regular plant is not profitable when the grid is humming along. But if the grid is stressed, then the clearing price goes way up and the plant is profitable, so it's happy. Look at the incentives to the grid nowadays, and they are not about reliability or even clean power.
Yeah, it's insane. And one of the points is that keeping fuel on hand is a lose-lose for the generator. So having
Yeah.
a reliable fuel source, whether it's coal or uranium or other things that can be used in case that there's a supply chain problem or a major winter snap and you can't move things around that good, that the generation continues to happen. But yet these plants get penalized, which is just insane. And to get more into the point of what you were just talking about, shorting the grid, I feel like this is a culmination of the just in time, this whole idea of the free market approach where everything is just in time and it's all about these efficiencies and there's very little backup built in. And then people and traders and speculators getting involved that are making money that have no business in actually creating power. They're generating their own wealth through speculation, through the large swings in the price. And that's where the business model is to try to collect profits through the large swings, which actually parasitizes the system instead of actually delivering reliable, low cost, low pollution electricity and power. And this is what I'm seeing, throughout our entire system. And it's almost like a cancerous approach to how you do political economy.
Well, one of the things is that they sort of get a market that isn't a market. In other words, it's a lot of fun to watch the large swings and be a trader and make money on them. But when you get right down to it, I am a ratepayer and I don't have very many choices. Now, if it was really a market, let's look at a very simplistic market. Let's look at the farmer's market down the street. Okay. I can go there and I can say, these zucchinis look good. I'll buy them. Okay. No, those others there, they're cheaper. Maybe I should buy them. Well, no, they don't. Some of them don't look as good, but I can choose some. In other words, I get lots of choices as a farmer's market. I have no choices about electricity. I mean, in some areas, they have allowed some kinds of choices, But most areas you don't get to choose. You have a default provider, that's your provider. So all this regulation is all about this fakey auction stuff that I'm sorry, I hate to describe it as fakey auction, but if nobody is incentivized to actually provide the customer, that is somebody like me, with low cost power, then all these auction stuffs are just part of the whole system for getting trading and arbitraging and so forth. I read this book and it was very. I read it after I read this wrote Shorting the Grid, and I probably wouldn't have put it in Shorting the Grid anyway because Shorting the Grid is very practical. All my examples are practical. But I read a book called The Knowledge We've Lost in Data. And one of the theses of this book is that sometime in the 70s, economists, instead of trying to describe the market or even tweak the market with tax rules and so forth and so on, began saying that they could design markets for certain kinds of outcomes. So instead of just a market is like, I go and buy some zucchinis, a market is something that an economist designed for outcomes. Well, this is not about the end user, the customer. And I talked about this in the book, and it was quoted by this part of the book was quoted by the Don Christ, the consumer advocate for New Hampshire, in his review of the book. And it was when I said, I went to a meeting and I realized that I didn't have the money to become a stakeholder. You have to buy into being a stakeholder. And I really realized that I looked around as a stakeholder as I was invited to the meeting as a guest. And all of a sudden, I just felt like a serf. They were the stakeholders. I'm a nobody. I mean, and I don't feel like I am personally a nobody. It was like my viewpoint and how things get done. It's not represented here.
Yeah. You're a subject, not a citizen anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to be mindful of your time, but I do really want to talk about the renewable wishful thinking and the distributed generation ideas. And the idea that, well, let's just do batteries, it's fine. Okay, so wind and solar, right? Wind, you can't really rely on when it's not windy, and solar shuts down 365 days a year. But we're going to get batteries on the grid, and you have a great write up about this wishful thinking. Could you just talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, yes, it is. It is wishful thinking that batteries are going to back up the whole grid, and people imagine that they're going to just suddenly get a lot better. And there are I don't want to get too detailed with this here, but there are rules about how to make a good battery, and it has to do with the EMF series and stuff like that, which is why the people are using lithium. And it is not because people are a little weird and they're using lithium, it's because of the properties of lithium for making a battery. Unfortunately, those same properties make lithium batteries very flammable. And so, for example, Moss Landing that PG&E built they're very proud of this as a battery system, but it could only back up the grid. Oh, it couldn't back up the grid at all. It could back up the grid for, I don't know, 30 seconds or 2 minutes or something, the local California grid. But what it can do is it can back up a power plant for maybe an hour. I mean, this battery, let's say that it can provide 200 megawatt hours. I don't know if it can provide that much or it can provide 400 megawatt hours. Vermont Yankee was the power plant that was the nuclear plant that was considered too small to be cost effective. Okay, so it was too small. It was 600 megawatts and it could run for 18 months. So now you have something that can maybe make 200 megawatt hours, and everybody's like, "This is the future. This is the future." No, after the 200, after it discharges, you got to charge it up again with a power plant.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is so, the batteries are so minuscule compared to the grid.
Yeah.
Now, one of the things that I feel that has contributed to the batteries will save us thing is the way power plants pay for transmission. And one of the ways they pay is that the transmission costs are allocated depending on the distribution utilities share of the highest hour on the grid. So, for example, if Green Mountain Power is 8% of the local grid at the highest hour on the local grid, it has to pay 8% of the transmission costs for the whole grid. Well, the thing is that Green Mountain Power bought a lot of Tesla batteries. And when the price on the grid, when the requirements on the grid get high, it just begins discharging its batteries for its own users. And therefore, it is drawing less from the grid. And so it saves its users money because other people's utilities are going to pay for transmission on the grid, and Green Mountain Power is going to pay less. So you see, Green Mountain Power will advertise something like, due to our batteries, we saved $400,000 in an hour. Yeah, because somebody else is paying that $400,000 for the transmission overall, not just that hour.
Yeah. And you talk about the tragedy of the commons and how that one state can be completely reliant on another state. And then, like Vermont, can be completely dependent on hydro in Canada and say, look at how clean our energy is. And
Oh, yeah.
it's all dependent on the transmission lines coming from Canada, which can be shut off in the winter when Canada needs its own power
Right.
for during the winter. So just going beyond shorting the grid, your book, you've also written Campaigning for Clean Air, Strategies for Pro-Nuclear Advocacy, and Voices for Vermont Yankee. And you run, is it Carnot Communications?
Carnot Communications, yes. Thing is, it's Carnot. I tend to do little mini jokes. For example, shorting the grid is a pun on both shorting and the big short. And Carnot Communications is put on the Carnot cycle. I mean, the Carnot cycle, is the most efficient type of power plant you can have. And it's a theoretical cycle. We don't actually have any. What I mean by a cycle is thermodynamics determines how much work, in this case, electricity, you can get out of a heat engine. And a heat engine can be a gas turbine, a coal-fired plant, a nuclear plant, anything that uses heat to make mechanical energy that becomes electricity by turning turbines and generators. And so I just thought it was fun to call it Carnot Communications as the most efficient way to get some work out of all the heat. Of course, I had one. I had one thing where I ran into a friend of mine on the street where shortly after I was started at Carnot Communications, and I said, "Oh, I just started a little company. I'm really excited about it." He said, "What is it?" And I said, "Well, it's called Carnot Communications." He said, "Meredith, you're kidding me? Carnal Communications?" I said, "No, it's not Carnal. It's the heat engine
Carnot.
cycle of
Not
Carnot,
Carnot.
named after Sadie Carnot, who was
Yeah.
of France and Egypt."
Love it. I love it. And I love everything you're doing to just get people educated on what the grid is and how to engage more with their local utilities. Could you talk a little bit about, as we're closing out here, what people can do to learn more beyond buying this book and reading it and becoming more knowledgeable as a consumer and a citizen, but how to engage with this whole grid idea that you present?
Well, if you're in a vertically integrated area, you can uh, you can go to your public utility meetings. They will have many open meetings. They will make a statement about their integrated research plan, and you can write notes about it and so forth. If you're in a quote deregulated area, things are much more closed, and it's harder to get a handle on what's going on. But you still can. You have to follow utility dies, and you have to follow your own RTO's website, and you have to write letters, and you have to go to open meetings if you can, if there are open meetings. Our grid operators not big on open meetings. Other grid operators are more big on it. But there, and as I say to people, there are no sunshine laws on the grid. There are sunshine laws for our legislatures. Whether they meet those sunshine laws or not, you can at least appeal to them as a way to get to understand what's going on. I also suggest that you subscribe to two things on the web that are free. One is Utility Dive. It's a online magazine, and it's really excellent. And the other just started out. Emmett Penny, who also writes as Nuke Barbarian, pro-nuclear man, and he decided he wasn't pussyfooting around about it.
I love it. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
great.
Anyway, he has started 3 times a week a newsletter called Grid Brief, which is excellent. And I'm so happy to see him doing that. And it's been so needed. Now, you understand that I pioneered this material, but I'm not ashamed to say I'm a grandmother. I'm in my 70s. I mean, I'm in good health. So far, my mind seems to be okay. But what I'm trying to say is, I can't plan to follow how the grid is going to evolve for the next 20 years. We need to have people like you, people like Emmett Penny, people like Chris Kiefer,
Yeah, he's great.
who are really following it. But I would say that the first step is to find out your RTO's website if you're in an RTO area. Get very familiar with it, ready to write emails and letters, be gadfly, read Emmett Penny's brief, read Utility Die. Those are 3 ways you can continue your education.
Well, Meredith Angwin, thank you so much for your time, and everyone should go out and get shorting the grid. And let's keep on pushing, keep on trying to educate, organize, mobilize, and take power to try to get the power as reliable, as inexpensive, and as clean as possible. So Meredith, thank you for your time.
Thank you very, very much.